Winter is coming. Welcome to my Bathory album ranking. It's interesting to review these albums today from a different perspective than 20-30 years ago when they were new. I never met Quorthon personally, but I knew his father. Börje Forsberg, head of Black Mark Records, invited me to Sweden in 1995 to make interviews with some of his new signings, Morgana Le Fay and Chad Morose. Boss, as they called him, was a friendly man who generously paid for plenty of drinks. By that time, a myth had already grown around Bathory. This ain't no ordinary band we're talking about today. Quorthon had said 1990 in an interview with Ian Page's magazine that never playing live was rather caused by lineup changes and the lack of good clubs in their local area than a plan to be shrouded in secrecy. On the other hand, I remember asking Börje if Quorthon was his son, which was just a rumor at the time. He wouldn't confirm it, he wouldn't deny it, he just wouldn't answer that question. So the whole air of mystery around Bathory developed partly intentional, partly accidentally, adding up well to the desired effect at the end. Joining my quest today is a new face. Madeleine will take care of the album cover presentation. An album from Bathory's thrash period, which is rather forgettable. By the mid-90s there were hundreds of thrash metal bands out there who had played this kind of music for 5 or 10 years already. If they sound more convincing on their albums, it's because they're 100% into thrash. Quorthon was just playing around with another musical style he'd like to test. It's also poorly produced and it's never going to be able to compete with the full-blooded bands, if I may say so. Quorthon's first attempt on thrash was the better one. Bathory are keeping a high aggression level here, and the LP includes a couple of memorable songs like Pax Vobiscum and War Machine. Destroyer of Worlds is a mixed bag. There are nerve-wracking thrash pieces like Bleeding and Kill, 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 but also songs like Ode or the doomy Pestilence, which sound closer to the more epic Bathory style. But I think if we call the whole offering half-baked in comparison to round albums like Hammerheart, that should be fair enough. If you listen to Twilight of the Gods for a minute or two, you're really impressed. It has this sense of grandeur which makes it larger than life. But over nearly 1 hour running time, frankly it becomes a little bit boring. To enter a mountain, for example, makes me want to skip it every time the repetitive chorus sets in again. Bathory had a good development over their 4th and 5th album towards a more melodic and epic style, but here on the 6th album they took it a step too far and didn't put enough metal in it. "20 years ago, when this was released, I wrote only a lukewarm review for this album. By then, many disciples had picked up the lore of Hammerheart and evolved their own musical strength in pagan metal, as it was now called. The return of the Masters, therefore, failed a little to impress. With a Blind Guardian-style ballad like Ring of Gold, an aggressive track like Dragon's Breath, and a groovy epic like Great Hall Awaits a Fallen Brother, you realize the musical variety is really good, but Northland One was not going to be a classic like the albums of the 80s. In 1996, after Requiem and Octagon, Bathory must have realized their fans preferred the more epic style of Bathory because they reverted to older material. Blood on Ice was a concept album originally written in 1989 already, which means before Hammerheart. Bathory sound very original here. They impress even with an acoustic guitar ballad like Man of Iron. Although poorly produced, Blood on Ice is a captivating album with stories to tell. If released a couple of years earlier, it probably would have been a bigger success, but 1996, it sounded like a mediocre sequel to albums whose forerunner it actually was. In case you've forgotten about this album, give it a second chance, you might be surprised. part of Nordland has the stronger musical ideas in my view. Tunes like Vinland or Death and Resurrection of a Northern Sun are complex and fascinating. Being the last Bathory album, it was a good way to close this extraordinary career. The second Bathory album has a lot of great stuff like The Rite of Darkness, Total Destruction and The Return of Darkness and Evil, but I would take the debut with me to the famous Lonely Island if I could bring only one of them. Very close decision though. The history of Bathory is inseparable from the history of Black Mark. Which other band had the luxury of a record label treating them as #1 priority from the start? The advantage is that you can put out a totally uncompromising release that would have been rejected by probably all other labels at the time. Songs like Reaper, War or Sacrifice still blow most black metal wannabes out of the water. This 1984 debut was a milestone for black metal. One Road to Azerbaijan inspired a generation of Viking metal bands. This album still is a trip you've got to listen to from the first to the last track. Bloodfire and Death was kinda like the Crossroads album in the history of Bathory. While still maintaining the black metal aggression in songs like For All Those Who Died, other tunes were opening up the roads to epic metal. The lyrics to the title track read quite similar to early Manowar into Glory Ride, Hail to England style, while Odin's Ride over Nordland with the neighing of the horses sets up an atmosphere very different from the previous albums. Great record. The 7-minute epic Enter the Eternal Fire was easily the most impressive song the band had released so far. Massacre and Equimanthorn prove the band was still as brutal as ever. Woman of Dark Desires is a kind of namesake song. It tells the story of Countess Bathory. The myth of the vampire countess, both Venom and Bathory referred to in their lyrics, were mostly based on 19th century English literature, Gothic novels, whereas the real countess had lived almost 300 years earlier, so these horror stories had little to do with historical facts. I read an interesting book by Tony Thorne entitled Countess Dracula. The author did historical research in the Hungarian language, trial transcripts and other first-hand documents. Indeed, the Countess was accused of 300 murders, but only a handful of bodies could actually be traced, who even might have died of other causes, so the whole accusation seems to have run totally out of proportion. And then the fantasy of Victorian age writers propelled it further. So there's probably not more than a grain of truth in the whole story. But as long as it inspires metal bands to albums like this, I won't complain. See you.